Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our latest update in the Sea Grant Water Resources Network webinar series. We are here with NIDIS today to talk about drought information and resources to support Sea Grant programs, collaborating with NOAA's Integrated Drought Information System, also known as NIDIS program. And really appreciate having everyone with us today. We will be recording this and posting it online for individuals that are not able to join us. Just want to remind everyone that the Sea Grant Water Resources Network is a professional network of individuals within the different Sea Grant programs that are working on water resources related challenges and efforts. We have, these really relate to the main themes that are offered through the Sea Grant Visioning, Water Resources Vision, which look at environment and human health, water infrastructure, land development, restoration, and management, as well as water planning and socioeconomics. If you have additional questions about the Water Resources Network, please feel free to give me a call or email me, and we can send you additional information about that. We started the webinar series early last year in order to help raise awareness about and visibility of Sea Grant Water Resources programming that's within our wider network, but helping to kind of teach each other about some of the great things that we're doing within the network. This is targeted internal to our Sea Grant programs, really intending to highlight research, extension, education, and communication activities across the broad spectrum of water resources in general. Also want to provide opportunities and network to provide strategic thinking around pressing water issues that we're facing across Sea Grant. Today, we do have Meredith Muth and Molly from NIDIS that are here to talk to us about some of their efforts and how we can better collaborate across the programs. First of all, we want to ask if you guys could please take a few seconds to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, maybe what program you work with, but just give Molly and Meredith a little bit of an introduction on yourselves. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Meredith and let you run with it. Thank you, Meredith, for being with us today. We really appreciate your all's time.
This is a huge pleasure because I am an enormous Sea Grant fan. I came to NOAA as a Sea Grant Canals Fellow. I've worked at the national office. I've worked at state offices, and I'm just thrilled to be able to just listen and learn from the boots on the ground. I'm just really happy to have this conversation. So I come from the wet side, but now I'm on the dry side, a little bit on the drought end. And you can go to the next slide, Karen. And I just want to let you know how this conversation started. So recently I started working for a program we're going to talk about today related to drought in the United States. But my heart is still on the wet side. And I've been able to do a little bit of work with some coastal entities with the NIDIS program, et cetera. And I'm like, well, what about Sea Grant? Why can't we talk to them? Is Sea Grant even interested in drought? Because all the programs I work on, most of them are not even touching drought. You know, they're too much water usually. And so I reached out to Karen and others at the National Program Office, and she walked us through the Sea Grant Water Resources themes that were recently pulled together. And we did a kind of crosswalk. Well, how does drought connect to environmental and human health? Well, it does in a number of ways. And I'm not going to walk through this table here, but water quality, safe drinking water, public health, et cetera. Water infrastructure, another one of your themes, certainly incredibly related and dependent on water quantity and impacted by drought. Land management, restoration, and development. This is something we've been working on more recently, quite a bit, ecological drought. And then water planning and socioeconomics, another area that NIDIS is really getting more excited about and investing some areas in, you know, economic impacts and how we evaluate this competing use of water resources. So that's kind of, we're like, okay, yeah, we've got enough, I think they're there to really have a conversation. And so Karen suggested that one of the best places to start is through this webinar series. And so we're really happy to be here. Next. We were also really happy to see of who registered, because a lot of times people think about drought just being this Western thing, this California thing. And of course, California was right up there in terms of the most representatives from Sea Grant programs that signed up to attend this webinar today, as well as Florida. which is where I'm from. But we were really happy to see this geographic diversity. And we're also really happy to see that we had representation from extension, education, as well as research. So next. And it's really important because, drought really does impact all those states in different ways. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. When you register, we also asked a question, what are some current or future activities that you are doing in your Sea Grant Program Office right now related to drought? And this is something that really surprised me. We had quite a bit of response, and I kind of bin these into these three areas. One is more looking at ecosystem impacts, ecology, resource management, how it's used to inform conservation, stewardship, and management practices. We also heard from a few that are working on climate adaptation and resilience planning, and how do you incorporate drought as one of many hazards that these coastal communities, not just coastal communities, but states are facing, right? Increasingly, we're seeing states that are dealing with this kind of flip-flop of some drought and then some flood, and drought and flood. How do you deal with both of those? And then we also saw a combination of water education, water demand forecast, as well as some focusing on farming and agriculture. So that was great. And these are all areas that we are also working on too, and hopefully we'll be able to support the work that you're doing on the ground. So next. And then our last question that we asked was, how do you rate your understanding of drought, in particular drought impacts to the work that you do? And this is actually, this was better than I expected, and I was really happy. So it seems like there's a big cohort here that has a limited general understanding, not as many experts, quite a few well-versed. And so this was kind of like that perfect curve we always look for. And so it sounds like there's an opportunity here for us to kind of bring forward some of those limited general, move them forward to the right a little bit more. So next. Oh, and then the final question was, where do you get your drought information? Who do you reach out to? And a huge list of people, from individuals to federal agencies. Only one person listed NIDIS. So we're hoping that by the end of this webinar, if you are looking for information on drought, formally, informally, that you'll be able to know that you have a resource right here at NOAA to help support the work you do. So what we're going to do now is share for you some additional resources to help you, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards on potential areas of collaboration. So next. And so what I'm going to do right now, again, my name is Meredith Muth. I am one of the regional drought information coordinators. We'll talk about that. I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Molly, who's going to introduce herself. I also wanted to let you know that we have a great showing online too right now of a couple of our other coordinators, many of whom also are very familiar with the Sea Grant program. We've got Brick. Anyways, you can see them in the chat, so take a look. And so with that, I am passing my virtual baton over to Molly.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. So I am Molly Wolozin. I am one of the regional drought information coordinators with NIDIS, along with Meredith, and as she said, a few others that are on the call. But I actually do have a history with Sea Grant myself as well. Before working with NIDIS, I worked with Illinois, Indiana Sea Grant. So I see Margaret here. It's great to see you. And I worked with Sea Grant for about 6.5 years and loved my time with Sea Grant. And so Sea Grant Academy alum in 2017, and that still remains, I think, my favorite experience in my professional career so far. So Sea Grant Academy was great. So I will kick us off here with a little bit more information about NIDIS. And next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit just briefly about what is NIDIS, and then get into some resources and a little bit more information about exactly the work that we do, especially through our regional networks. And then we'll finish it up with some case studies highlighting some of our collaboration. Next. So first off, what is NIDIS? And again, that is the National Integrated Drought Information System. So NIDIS was first authorized by Congress in 2006, and we've been reauthorized twice since then. And we have an interagency mandate to develop and provide a national drought early warning system. So what exactly does that mean, a drought early warning system? Well, I'll get into those specifics later, but essentially It's really to help our country move from a reactive to a more proactive approach when it comes to drought. And so NIDIS itself sits within NOAA OAR, so we are within the Climate Program Office. But again, we do have an interagency mandate, meaning that we are to be working across all different agencies across government, whether that's at the federal level, state, tribal, and also with local partners. And we also are to be working with the private sector, academic institutions, citizen scientists, and basically really anyone that's working in the space of drought. And so we've been doing this work since 2006, although we have evolved quite a bit over the last few years. And I would say today we have a lot more capacity than we have in the past. And so we're excited to talk with you about the work that we do. Next. So this slide just kind of provides an overarching look at exactly what we do within NIDIS. So we do have regional networks. Currently, we have 8 of them, and we'll show you a map later on of where those regions are and what exactly we do. A lot of our focus is collaboration with programs and partners that are already existing within these regions, and to hopefully really just amplify the needs and the work that are already going on within the region, and to make connections with one another, to learn from one another when it comes to drought. As a program that's situated in OAR, we do a lot of research, and integrated applied research is really our focus. We also do work in the space of drought prediction, forecasting, monitoring, and also planning and preparedness. And we also have the US Drought Portal, which is I don't really like the word clearinghouse, but essentially a place to go for information on drought for the US, the official federal government website for that. Next slide. And so now I'll get into a little bit more information about drought.gov and some of the resources that we do have. Drought.gov itself is a really comprehensive website, and there is a lot to look at. So I definitely will not be able to do the website too much justice today. So I definitely encourage you to go look at the website. We relaunched this website in early 2021. And the redesign is really great because it provides a lot more information on drought conditions at various levels. So you can go from the international level all the way down to your local conditions. And so you can put in your zip code or your county, state, region, and you can get information about drought. And we really try to make it as interactive and interesting as possible by showing connections to different sectors. For instance, what's the impact of drought on agriculture or public health or other water resources, for instance. So we have a lot of information in our by sector location on the web page there, if you see at the top where it says by location. So you can get a lot of information that's tailored to what you're looking for. We also have a research and learn session that kind of gets back to the basics of drought. Personally, what I find most interesting is really being able to keep track of my local conditions and to look at various scales of drought. So I definitely encourage you to check out drought.gov. Next slide. One thing that we wanted to mention to this group, because we know that you all are on the ground and really working with local communities, is to talk about the importance of drought impact reporting. And really the value of knowing what is happening on the ground is incredibly important when it comes to drought monitoring, whether this is for information that's being put into the US Drought Monitor, which is what's tied to a lot of financial aid, for instance, for relief when it comes to drought, but also for states and local departments to understand, how their area is impacted by drought to hopefully inform their response and also planning. And so there are systems in place where anyone can actually go report the conditions that they're seeing on the ground. So the ability to report drought impacts has sort of evolved over time. And right now, what it looks like and what we have found to be most useful is really reporting conditions. So not just focusing on the dry side, but also the wet side. So we've highlighted a resource here called the Condition Monitoring Observer Reports, which is a system that the National Drought Mitigation Center has developed in partnership with NIDIS and others, where anyone can go into this fairly easy survey online and show where they are on that spectrum. Are they really dry? Are they really wet? What are they actually seeing in their backyard? And the point of this is to be able to show what's happening and to get some ground truth for what the data is actually showing, because there's a lot of different ways to look at drought, whether you're looking at soil moisture, precipitation, water levels, reservoir levels. Those sometimes might be conflicting with one another. So it's helpful to look at on the ground reports to kind of show what's really happening. And through this system, you can actually also report or show pictures. So I put an example here of a report recently from California where they included a picture as well as the impact of drought, particularly when it comes to the impact on trees in the area and surface water. So that's a resource that's available for anyone to go in and submit their reports on what's happening. And it's really useful to the states that are actually putting input into the drought monitor and coordinating the monitoring for the state itself. Next slide. Oops, oh, I thought those were, oh, they went a little out of order, I think. Anyway, so I wanted to briefly talk about the research that we support. Again, as I mentioned, we are within OAR, and so we do support quite a bit of research, and we really try to focus this on the applied research. And so we wanted to showcase some of the examples of how we support this research, primarily through our competitive funding opportunity, which is called Coping with Drought, and it's ran through the Climate Program Office. And Britt Parker, one of our coordinators that's on the call, is the person that leads this effort for us. But essentially every other year, I think for the most part, is when we put out a competition and we support research on drought related topics like agriculture, ecosystems, water resources. And a lot of this is applied research, really focused on the development of user end tools, decision support tools that are actually used at the regional, state, or local level. And so currently, just to show an example of what we're funding, the current FY22 focus of projects that are funded are going to be on ecosystem impacts and also tribal resilience, and funding projects on the ground that are building resilience on tribal nations across the country. Another way that we support research is through regional and state research projects. So these really focus on the co-production of applied research to help address those needs at the state and regional level. And so these projects can look a little bit different. The one example that we can showcase is recently there was a new dashboard that was developed through drought.gov for the ACF, which is the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint. I think I got that right. River Basin. And this drought and water dashboard was in development with partners throughout the region. And there was a lot of back and forth between the research and those that were creating the tool and those that would actually be using the tool. So really that co-production is really important when it comes to the research that we fund. And we know that that's also important to Sea Grant as well. Next slide. So now to get a little bit more into our regional networks and what we call our drought early warning systems, or DEWs. So a drought early warning system is really using a place-based approach to identify the needs and information that are needed across these different regions to advance drought early warning for drought. And so before we look at the regions, let's just briefly talk about what exactly is a drought early warning system. Even though a drought early warning system might sound like we're just talking about the forecasting of drought and having more advanced notice, it really is a lot more than that. It encompasses all of these different areas that you see in those little yellow bubbles that really help us become more aware of the conditions that are happening and more prepared for what we might be seeing in the future. So the different topics that encompass drought early warning are observations and monitoring, planning and preparedness, predictions and forecasting, communication and outreach, and also interdisciplinary research and applications. And so these are really the building blocks that make up all of these regional drought early warning systems. And what's really important about these different networks that we have in the region is that they really are coming from the ground up. So for instance, if we look at the Southeast DEWS or Drought Early Warning System, we have information in a strategic action plan, and all of the activities within this strategic action plan were identified through engagement with partners on the ground in the Southeast states. And these were identified as needs and activities that would be really beneficial to advance drought early warning in the Southeast DEWS. And so those are within the strategy, and then we do what we can as a network in the region to really advance these efforts forward. And so you can see to date, we have 8 regional drought early warning systems officially established. But I also did want to point out on here that this map shows some areas that have dashed or hash marks on them, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico in particular, where we do have drought early warning investments. So essentially what we mean by that is that we are supporting people that are on the ground in these areas to help us provide drought information for stakeholders in these areas. So while it's not in an official dues, we are trying to do what we can to support advancing drought early warning in these areas. And we'll talk about one example of this in just a little bit. Next slide. So to give a little bit more tangible information as to what a dues network looks like in action, I just provided one brief example here for each of those different components. So communications and outreach is a big part of what NIDIS does with our partners, with our regional partners. And what that might look like is communicating the current conditions, impacts, and outlooks for drought in the region. So I have an example here just recently for a drought status update for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So this is something that's sent out to our listserv, which we'll talk about here in a second, where we are just trying to communicate the most recent information to those partners in that region related to drought. We also, in the predictions and forecasting space, we support a lot of research from the Climate Prediction Center and also university researchers to hopefully improve seasonal to subseasonal forecasting or that advanced notice that we might have that drought could be an issue. When it comes to observations and monitoring, we are always, one of the places that we work a lot in this space is on increasing the availability of data, for instance, soil moisture data, which can help both drought and flooding prediction. With planning and preparedness, we support states to help identify what drought indicators are best to identify drought in their region and to incorporate this information into their state plans so that they can be more responsive to drought. And finally, as I mentioned, we do support a lot of research and applications. And at the regional scale, this depends on the topics that are most relevant to that region. One here for the Midwest region and the Great Lakes that we've been researching is focused on looking at rapid transitions from too much to too little water and the future occurrence of those happening, which we've just seemed to have it more and more often that we're going from too little to too wet. Next slide. So just one more slide here before I turn it back to Meredith. We wanted to showcase a couple of case studies, and this one in particular is showing our support that we've been giving to Hawaii over the last few years. Again, Hawaii is one of those states where we do not have an official dues, but we really have been trying to support efforts as we can. And that means having a partnership with those partners that you see here on this screen. I listed their names just in case they're familiar with any of you that are from Hawaii. But the sort of work that we're supporting there is doing a Hawaii drought needs assessment and helping to develop a formalized structure to help partners exchange information about drought in Hawaii and also the Pacific Islands. We've helped support the development of a rangeland information portal decision support tool for the ranching community. And in work moving forward, a lot of the work that's been done in Hawaii, we're going to help expand those similar efforts to the Pacific Islands. Next slide. And here I will turn it over to you, Meredith, to finish up these slides since this is in your region.
That's great, thanks. This is the last slide of just our 101 of NIDIS, and hopefully it generated a few ideas, and then we'll move on to a little discussion. But another case study we thought would be interesting. I think these case studies are helpful because you might be sitting there thinking, okay, well, I work in the state program office working with the academia, et cetera, on extension, how can we really connect to this national level program in a meaningful way to represent our needs? And so an example was, we had a regional network that was focused in the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina. So it was one of these DEWS networks, and it was exclusively focused on coastal impacts because coastal areas got very little attention in terms of many of the drought impacts compared to agriculture. And I know that North Carolina and South Carolina Sea Grant were part of these early discussions, probably like 8 years ago is when it started. And so when we brought together the community, the broader coastal community, what we heard is that coastal drought, of course, is incredibly unique, complicated, especially when you look at estuaries and how much fresh water is flowing into those estuaries to support the marshes and the species, et cetera. And it was very clear that the current indicators they used for early warning of drought or what the current conditions were just not sufficient to represent the unique characteristics of these estuaries in the coastal areas. And so working with those partners and USGS, NIDIS was able to say, okay, we hear you have a need. We're going to put in some of our resources and we're going to work with you and partners over the next few years. And then USGS eventually took it over and made this product operational. So it was initially focused on the Carolinas and has since then expanded across the entire Eastern Seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. I put a link in the chat to see the actual indicator. And we're also funding some research to look at case studies of how this could actually be utilized in terms of resource management, research, as well as early warning. So that's it. Next. So what, before we jump into just a really informal dialogue about, okay, was anything exciting? Did you hear anything you want to talk more about? What did we not talk about? Before we go to that, I just want to kind of push pause and see if you have any questions or comments or reactions to anything you heard. I know we gave you a ton of information in a really short time. So you are welcome to either enter in chat or you can go ahead and just raise your hand and we'll just talk. Any questions? Also, is there any of the other NIDIS staff that would like to add anything at this time to what we said or didn't say before we move on to discussion? Okay, great. Guess Molly, we just nailed it, right? No, just kidding. Okay, next. Okay, so based on a little bit of the capacity of what the NIDIS program does, and I'll just let you know, it's a national program that sits in Boulder, but we have staff members scattered throughout the country, especially from a regional component. And do you see any opportunities building on work you've already done or are doing or would like to do for incorporating drought and low flow into your sea grant programs and activities? And so I'm just going to kind of let that sit there. There are no bad answers. You can think outside the box, recognizing that we are able to bring to the table potentially resources as well as expertise and partners that we've developed throughout the states and regions. So feel free to answer either into chat or raise your Zoom hand. Ruby? And if you could introduce yourself and where you're from, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Ruby Papp with Hawaii Sea Grant on the island of Kauai. And I think one of the things that may be expanding in I'm an extension agent, so I don't really conduct very much research, although I've done a couple isolated projects, but mainly I do outreach, education, and technical assistance to the local government here and the community here, mainly in the context of climate adaptation planning in particular. And one of the things that we're learning more about in our, when I say we, I mean in our local community, is that wildfire in Hawaii is, the risk here is actually just as high as it is on the, like in California, which is not something that's in our day-to-day discussions when we talk about climate change. Typically, we talk about, a big one is sea level rise and flooding and all that. But I'm working with the local government on a plan for climate adaptation. And we've done a comprehensive, vulnerability assessment with a consultant. And the resources that we have in Hawaii definitely show that wildfire is right up there, and it's not something that I've done a lot of extension work at all on. So I'm just realizing that needing to expand my repertoire, so to speak, in terms of my role, and it's not necessarily my background either. So, but it's definitely becoming an emerging issue. I guess as it relates, obviously, wildfire relates to drought and the times when we're drier, we're more at risk. So, any resources you might have on sort of, it's just not part of the regular conversation here yet with wildfire. It's like kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people. We live in Hawaii, like, how can this be a risk for us? So.
Thanks for Ruby. I appreciate that too, because I work in the Southeast where they always think there's plenty of water. And it's more about too much water. But when the drought happens, like you said, it can be very significant. There are a couple of resources. I think I'm going to first bridge.
Sorry, trying to unmute. Are you there? I think you froze, but maybe it was me.
If you're on the call, would you like to respond to Parker is also regional coordinator for the Pacific Northwest, and she is also leading our drought and wildfire efforts.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so drought and wildfire, we recognize this is a really complex relationship. And one thing that I would say for Hawaii and the Pacific Islands is there's actually a group there that's a big partnership called the Pacific Fire Exchange. And it's a fire science exchange network. And so that's one place that I would perhaps point you to for resources. And we're actually working with partners in Hawaii on a similar drought network of practitioners who are working on drought. But I think that's one of the first places that you might look for resources that are really specific to Hawaii and the conditions and there and how drought and wildfire may interact.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the resources. I guess I'm just sort of expressing the changing extension, changing thing, we're always changing, but just more whether there are other extension faculty on or what sort of, what other people are, if other people are dealing with similar things in their work and in their communities as well that are less advanced in the, and the adaptation to this issue.
Yeah, it feels like there's always new issues. There's never issues that fall off the table. There's just more to learn about.
Yeah, that just get piled on. Yeah.
So Ruby, as part of what you be, are there other Sea Grant programs who are experiencing something similar to what Ruby's talking about? Because this is actually an area, for example, if there's multiple state programs that have kind of going through this transition and a cultural transition from an extension perspective of how we view hazards instead of these, traditional single hazards, and now you have others and the compounding effects. That, for example, that's something that might actually lend itself to a really interesting research project, including social science and attitudes, as well as the foundational research. So I'd be curious if there are other state programs that are also kind of going through this transition. Are you hearing more about drought that you didn't hear about before, for example? I know it's not just you, Ruby. I know. But anyways, keep that in the back of your head. I think it's a really interesting point, and something we would, would be interesting to further explore. I have a question from Rob Vincent in the chat. Rob, would you like to speak to your comment?
Sure. It's not a question. I just the question on the screen just says how would you be incorporating drought and low flow in some of the work you do, and those are just a couple examples that I just came to mind. Certainly aquaculture with freshwater discharge into coastal areas. That affects salinity, drought, low water affects water temperatures. Both of those things can have adverse impacts on shellfish as well as finfish. Evaporation in coastal habitats, that has a big effect on the vegetation communities, and both in terms of a lot with plant competition, but also plant die off with drought conditions, especially in August. You'll see a lot of plant die off, but also invasive species then can come in and invade those areas. So you have habitat loss, degradation, reduced coastal resilience, as well as invasive species issues. And then low flow in rivers, where you have that affects habitat, ecosystem connectivity, ecosystem services, as well as fish passage issues. I do a lot of work with fisheries, and low flow is becoming a problem with some of these fish passage restoration sites that we're dealing with. So just a couple of thoughts.
Oh, thanks. You just summed it up really well. So I wanted to just quickly touch on the aquaculture, which I know is a really, a priority for the Sea Grant program, at least nationally, and then in some of the state programs as well. I actually ran the national aquaculture competition a few years ago. Are there other states here who are, how is drought being talked about in your aquaculture programs at the state level? Could anybody speak to that? Is it really coming up? Is it coming up by the companies, by the private sector, by the fishermen? Any thoughts?
Hi, this is hi everyone. Thanks, Meredith, and for setting up this session. I just came back from the National Agriculture Extension Conference in Maine, and water resources were cited in terms of, geographic siting and permitting. However, most of the systems that are land-based are actually in recirculating systems, so the amount of water that is lost is rather low. It's not a constant pass-through that gets directly discharged. And even one of our newest sturgeon farms is pretty much of a closed loop, even though part of it is outside, because the outside part is mainly for filtration. But so in terms of water usage, it's not a high amount because it's retained. That's the whole purpose for these recirculating systems.
It's great to hear. Thanks, Sam. Oh, I remember you, Samuel. I remember your name. Hi. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I never saw drought mentioned in, I don't think, any of the proposals that came in a couple of years ago through the aquaculture competition. So,
yeah.
So Sam, can I follow up with that? Is this to mean that we, and I know we is a very broad statement here, but Sea Grant's not doing a whole lot of farming, offshore farming, if you will. It's mostly inshore in these closed systems, so we're not seeing the impacts. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, Sea Grant, except for example, in the Great Lakes, where they're actually raising fingerlings, like for yellow perch to be released then in open water systems for recreational catches. There's much of that is actually in these recirculating systems. But however, any businesses that want to site a on-land basis, they are either have to work with municipal water supply to connect to, or else they actually have to have water rights, which is a whole different issue. And that's something we probably want to work with the Sea Grant Law Center in that how do we actually balance water right issues for aquaculture siting, because even
I think we lost Sam there briefly. Can anybody speak to impacts on oysters and clams and some of those other things that I know that are very popular, and in oyster gardening and oyster farming and those sorts of things? Do we have anybody here that can speak to any of those?
Ruby, is that a legacy hand?
No, but I'm not an expert on shellfish either. So I'll wait for the response there. Maybe Danny.
Danny, go ahead. Yeah, definitely shellfish estuaries. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, really, Rob hit the nail on the head there for a lot of the impacts. Most of the farmers that I speak to, and I'm also at MIT, so I'm also in Massachusetts, that Rob has a lot of experience with. But one of our biggest issues tends to be too much water. And when there are high rain events, it tends to shut down a lot of areas to harvest. So there's a reduced income, some regulatory implications. I've had one regulator who complained that there has not been a huge rain event because that means that they haven't had a day off. So different perspectives there, but generally with nearshore aquaculture, other than changes in salinity, they are not utilizing freshwater inputs.
Great, thanks, Danny. I would really like to hear, oh, actually, Andrew, you just put something in if you'd like to do you want to articulate it or just have people read?
They might need to read it first because it's a somewhat complex, or not complex, but probably out of nowhere. Anyhow, we monitor freshwater anadromous salmonid populations in the Rush, and actually that photo that you have on the screen is our group. And one of the things that we started monitoring, we call it wet dry mappings. We map surface flow conditions in tributary streams in the Russian River watershed. We started doing that in 2012, and so we have about a 10-year data supply on that. But what we started to realize, that we were originally looking at just over summer survival. So we were doing these surveys kind of at the lowest time of the year that the fish would be experiencing. So typically September, October timeframe in our watershed. And that was where the focus started. And what we, through the drought, the peak of 2005, and now again, kind of surfacing back again, we're encountering the reality that we're actually not just seeing it for the juveniles rearing in that September, October timeframe, but also the outmigration for smolts in the kind of April, May timeframe. So streams are actually drying up at the mouth before the fish are actually able to move out of the system in typical times when this wasn't even something we thought about. And likewise, our adult returns are coming in kind of the early winter, November, December timeframe. We're also seeing it on that end, where we might not see enough rain to connect tributaries to the main stem of our river until late December. Worst case, we actually pushed all the way into February. And so adults are actually not able to even get into their natal streams to be able to spawn. So we're seeing it kind of on every life stage, which was never an issue and was never something that we were even thinking about being an issue. It was only focused on the rearing juveniles in the streams. You're muted, Meredith.
No, Andrew, I'm really glad you brought that up because you read my mind. I was going to actually talk about salmon a bit. I know that's really important, especially to the West Coast and actually some of the East Coast fisheries as well. And it was really interesting reading about the work that you've done on the Russian River. And unfortunately, I'm not surprised at what you're finding. What an amazing data set you have. Do you, a lot of there's a lot of people playing in the playground of salmon right now, and there's a lot of resources going into that. But I'm just curious, from the perspective of drought information, early warning to help maybe make some management decisions, are you getting a sense that, Russian River, California, et cetera, they have what they need? Or are you seeing opportunities maybe to improve some of the information, whether it's the timeliness or the parameters, et cetera? Because that's something that's kind of a sweet spot for NIDIS, working with partners to really make sure they're getting the information they need before, during, and after a drought.
So I think that, the getting the information quickly and being able to implement actions is the silver bullet, right? Like in a timely manner enough to be able to do something about it. For salmon populations, there's not too much you can do in the short term, right? I mean, there's fish rescues, but those are not necessarily a sustainable solution. I think the other issue that comes into play is just the unique, every watershed and even portions of streams, they're so complex, both geomorphologically as well as just the geology of them, that they respond very differently. So a lot of times it is just having that local knowledge and having that local kind of data set to support it. I think being able to model that at a larger scale would be amazing and would really be the next step in it. But again, it's so complex. I think Hannah Moidu she was a PhD student. I think she just finished up her PhD at Berkeley. Like she's probably done the best work that I've seen trying to get at that modeling. She is just released her research, or it's coming out soon. Very interesting, very impressive work. But it would need to be ground truth and kind of expanded out. And I could see that being very valuable. That would be, I think, as close as we could get to being able to get out ahead of how the drought might affect smaller stream systems like we're dealing with. But then the question is, what do you do with it if you have that information? What do you do with it? And I don't necessarily know, but there's a lot of people, I'm sure, who would love to have it.
Now that's great. And then in addition to, the salmon issue, our California dues coordinator had to step away, but are there other, drought obviously is just enormous out west right now, unprecedented, California being one of the states hardest hit. Do you see any new opportunities related to drought within the programming at California Sea Grant? And also if we have anybody maybe from Washington or Oregon on the call? It's okay. I know you guys are all so busy right now. You can't even think about new projects. Well, I'll just let that go out there. Ruby, I want to recognize that you made a really excellent point about traditional native uses for fish ponds in Hawaii. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi Meredith. I'm sorry, I should have responded. In Washington and also parts of Northern California, actually even in Central California, and certainly in Oregon, our coastal watersheds are made up of small drainages, highly in size, very steep. So when it comes to storage, there's not a lot of water that can be stored for the coastal communities, mainly because of the geography of these systems, and also these systems also vulnerable to effects like earthquakes, and in some cases, they're very vulnerable systems. So, so there are times where some of these communities, because their freshwater systems have to be sized for maximum capacity. For example, in tourist locations, most of the water demands are actually in the summer for tourism, but yet that's also a time where some of our communities, say Newport, Oregon, where much of the shrimp and fish processing occurs. So 2 years ago, there was the freshwater treatment plant had to shut down because of a filtration problem, and it pitted the tourism industry and the fish processing industry at odds because the city actually had to cut off the water supply to the fish processing to fish processors for about a week because tourists were there. So those are some of the areas that we actually have to balance in the coast, and that there's a lot of water that comes. The reality is that these communities face chronic and acute drought, while also at points some of the freshwater systems that tap into the local streams have to be shut off, mainly because you have to maintain enough flow for salmon that migrate in the fall. And oftentimes the way with our climate is that we are not getting the rains that actually come in the fall early enough to meet the local freshwater demands as well as the ecological demands. So, and I'm sure, and that's also true in California, at least from central to northern California, as well as in parts of Washington.
Great, thanks, Samuel. What about, we have a couple of people here on the call from Florida. Florida obviously is a really interesting state as usual, in particular when it comes to water. Do you have any thoughts on how drought is coming up and being incorporated or could be incorporated in the work you do, research, extension, education? Is Florida still on? Let's see, is Holly still on? Anna? Or did we lose them already? Holly, you still there?
Yeah, I just was gonna type in, sorry. I'm not sure. Actually was really interested when you put up the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee Flint, that resource, because I know that there's been a lot of discussions about drought within that region. So that is really cool that that is available. But I'm not sure. As far as like programming that I might be doing, I'd have to think about it.
Thanks. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I keep, every time you ask, I'm like, I keep thinking about it, but I'm just, yeah, not sure.
Yeah, obviously it's essential, of course, to agriculture down there and water supply. It's so heavily regulated in Florida. They usually are on top of it unless it's a pretty extreme drought. It's amazing how they move water around. Could you go?
Yeah, we definitely have quite the water management systems. And, just thinking locally, our rainy season kind of just started. And I know like at the end of April and May, at least in the area that I'm in like East Central Florida, there was a lot of talk and discussion about, how we just hadn't had, rain for such a long period of time, even though it was the end of the, dry season. So we knew hopefully it was going to rain soon, but I actually get the NIDIS, I don't know if it's weekly, but it's like the drought monitoring like email you can get for your area. So I actually put in my area.
Oh,
so that way I kind of get like the weekly emails that say whether or not I'm in a drought or not. And it really like just at the beginning of June was like, yes, it's abnormally dry, but now it's like, you're fine. So
actually, Molly, if you could put a link to that, yeah, you could just get pushed into your email whether or not you've changed your drought status according to the US Drought Monitor. So what I think I'll do because of time, if you could, Karen, can you go to the next slide? We have 2 poll questions we're going to do, but before we do that, I just wanted to put back up again. This is what we heard again of current or expected sea grant activities. We talked a little bit about resource management. We didn't really talk as much about, we talked a little bit about aquaculture. Climate adaptation and resilience. Is there anybody that would like to speak a little bit more? I know we had a comment about this right at the beginning, but how, from Hawaii, but how drought is coming up in some of your adaptation and resilience planning work? For example, is there anybody else on the call who's doing, working on adaptation plans or resilience plans, for example? I know that Ruby mentioned it. Rob?
Yeah, I guess it kind of goes back to this salt marsh restoration type of work. You know, a lot of everything in a salt marsh has to do with manipulating hydrology, and it's, you know, doing your hydrologic models, but then figuring out how to modify channels or sheet flow and all of that kind of stuff. And drought has a big effect on that, because if you get it wrong, then you lose a lot of the habitat either way, you know. So certainly with that kind of, and that's coastal resilience, because these habitats are buffering against storm surge and their stormwater retention areas, as well as nutrient filtration and stuff. So it's all has to do with resilience in this coastal habitats. So that's one example.
Got it. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, that makes perfect sense in terms of incorporating into coastal resilience. Okay, what I'd like to do next is if you could go to the next slide, please, Karen. And Molly's going to go ahead and put in to the chat a poll. And what we wanted to see is if we wanted to just get a sense on, is there, you know, this is hard to do on this overview webinar, but are there certain particular issues that maybe you or people in your state program or your region, you think you might want to learn a little bit more about? It doesn't have to be collaboration with a capital C, but something that we can do to further kind of explore how we can best support. And so there's a couple of areas up here, and what we'd love for you to do is just look at them, and you don't have to rank them all. Maybe just put, you know, maybe there's 1 or 2 or 3 that you're most interested in, just rank those. No need to like rank all 9. But I'll walk them through. So the first couple is more about just kind of understanding better, you know, what are the conditions of drought in your area? You know, where do you go to find that easily? We talked about drought.gov, but maybe there's other tools or resources you would like to know about, in particular indicators relevant maybe to ecosystems, ecological indicators. Second is understanding drought and climate change. So looking at more of the long-term trends in your state or region. The next couple is more focused on impacts, aquaculture and fisheries, as well as ecosystems. And I put water quality in there, although they are different. They obviously have a lot of synergy. And then planning efforts in your state and community, resilience and mitigation efforts in your state and community. Communicating drought, this is especially through extension education. Collaborative research opportunities, which again is something we do a lot of, interdisciplinary research. And finally, connecting to drought experts in your state or region. We know them all. And you know, we're a resource here to connect you to those people, whether it's a state climatologist, drought task team, researcher, et cetera. So if you could take a moment and just look through there and just identify 1 or 2 areas that you think you may want to learn more about or is relevant to your program. Okay, while people are still editing that, Sam, I'm going to definitely look at the water action plan for the Oregon coast. Can you just briefly tell me, so was Sea Grant asked to help facilitate discussions and developing a plan? Is that what happened? And I guess this is a question for Sam, and did you have the right expertise related to drought involved?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. So many of the smaller Oregon coastal communities, which is practically all of them, do not really have the adequate resources to do regional scale water action planning, but yet they're needed if they're going to be looking into what are some of the water issues and needs that press them, and what are the resources they need to be getting now to be prepared for it. So that's why we were called in to help facilitate this. Your second question about whether or not they actually have the drought resources, we did actually have the Oregon Water Resources Department engage in this, but however, they're more at the technical scale and not at the level of scale of community interpretation that your group would be able to provide. So having NIDIS engaged in that would have been really helpful in hindsight.
Great, Sam. Well, don't hesitate to reach out to us in the future. Again, we have Britt Parker on the call, who is very well connected with the networks and the experts in the Oregon and Washington area.
Great, thank you.
I mean, that's what we're here for, absolutely. And Rob, I'm really glad you mentioned groundwater. It's so hugely important. Okay, so I'm looking at the, oh, we got one more coming in, but it looks like, you start to see these natural breaks. Not surprisingly, impacts on ecosystems and water quality. In fact, NIDIS thought this was so important, recognizing NIDIS wasn't really working that much in the space previously, that last year we hosted this really well-attended national webinar series on ecological drought. It was co-organized between NIDIS and the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And there's, in fact, a whole section just on coastal, especially with marshes. So that might be interesting. I have that link in there, but I can put it back in again. And we use the outcomes from those webinars and the questions that came up from the participants and the speakers to inform the development of our research competition that went out this year, the Coping with Drought on Ecological Drought that you heard. So those awards should be announced soon. You can see those in on our website. Maybe we can share it with this group, and so that you might then see if any of those that received awards are actually in your region or state. That might be of interest to Sea Grant. And then impacts to aquaculture and fisheries. Oh, this moved around quite a bit all of a sudden. Is there any, I just want to focus on the first two, and then we'll go to the last poll question, which is a really easy one, and then we can wrap it up. But drought impacts on ecosystems and water quality. Does anybody want to provide any additional kind of details on what exactly that means? Are we talking about coastal, inland? Is there certain ecosystems? Is it basin-wide watershed approach? Is there anything anybody would like to share with us in terms of how you would utilize information on drought impacts and ecosystems and water quality?
I'll add one thing that we've experienced. I kind of rated the word community in there on a lot of these, and I kind of would add that the importance of community. It's everything's local, I think it's very important to remember that water quality is very, very localized too, and especially in the freshwater here that I work in. You can have very different droughts, can have very different effects on even within a watershed, even within a sub-basin, they can have very different effects on different streams and different groundwater. Groundwater is huge. So having kind of that community-based approach and the hyper localized is I think extremely important. I don't know how to get there. And again, how it gets used is always variable, but the more specifics, the better, the more local, the better, the higher resolution, the better.
Oh, absolutely, Andrew, thank you. And again, just a reminder, a quick plug, that drought.gov, you can look up your zip code, you can look up your city and find a plethora of information. But what you're really getting at is even more. It's one thing to just look at maps and ideas, but how do you put it into action? What does it mean in that local context? And that's something that we as a national program also, to be honest, struggle with. We want to help at the community level, but how do we do that at a national? It's hard enough at a state program. It's even harder at a national program. Okay, let's go to the next slide and the last quick poll. So Molly mentioned that we have these networks, these regional drought early warning systems. And we just wanted to provide an opportunity for you if you see if you're interested in joining a network, and I just did air quotes for those of you who may not be seeing me, we welcome you. Now, what does this mean? This is not a burden. This is not, you're not having to go to meetings once a week or anything like that. It's essentially you're added to a listserv where you could be part of a network that you can be in and out as much as you need to be. So there are occasional emails about upcoming events, workshops. You will receive when appropriate drought status updates pushed into your email, and we also post them online. Those are actually really great to then hit forward or add into a newsletter that maybe that you're sending out within your state, so that you can help take what we've already done the hard work of pulling together all this information, hopefully in mostly lay person's term, and then you can push it out as you think is appropriate. These drought status updates are usually done at regional or sub-regional levels. You can connect with other drought planners and experts, and NIDIS provides a full-time drought coordinator for each of these networks. So you can just pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm writing a proposal about this. Can you help find some information? Do you know anybody who's doing this? And again, we're a network here for you. So what I'm gonna do, we're gonna put up a poll, and then we're gonna ask you if you would like to join one of these dues, be added to the listserv, then go ahead and just put your name and what region. And then if you notice, there are those we talked about, the ones that have the stripes, the Hawaii, Alaska, and the US Caribbean. Those are fair game too. And then also if there's an area that's gray, you know, we're looking at Michigan, the mitten, we're looking at, you know, Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas, then we still support those areas, such as drought.gov covers the entire state. And we actually have coordinators working with, say, the state climatologists in those areas too. We just don't yet have the resources to have full-time coordinators in those areas, but feel free to identify those states. So any state you want. Yes, and Michigan is informally covered by Molly, and the Midwest is. And then in addition, if you would like to have a one-on-one talk just to get to know your regional coordinator about anything, we would love to talk to you. Just pick up the phone, have a little chat, hear what each person is doing in the region, learn more. We actually have Southeast News web pages that have the different activities that we're doing, etc. So actually, Molly, if you had a second to put up the Southeast News page, that would be great.
Meredith, I'll just throw in, if anybody doesn't want to get onto the poll everywhere, you can put your information in the chat and we'll get those to the right individuals as well.
Okay, great, thanks. And we're also happy to, if there's ever anything related to drought that you're doing, we're happy to amplify it through our channels as well, through our distribution list, our newsletters, etc. And I think, Karen, is there another slide after this? Okay, and that's it. Maybe we have a couple more, we have a few more minutes to just answer any questions you might have. Again, I'm supported here with Molly, my amazing colleague, and a couple of others. So I'll just open the floor right now.
I wanted to mention one thing that you guys, we talked about earlier just in passing, and I just wanted to reiterate how important I think it is that the concept of communicating drought. And one of the things that we've experienced in our watershed and trying to communicate the severity of drought is, I think that the false sense of security when your water year shows that you're fine and you're really not fine, you know, from the practical to you know what it's the whatever it is that you're worrying about. In our case, it's a fish species are actually experiencing, and that, you know, this last year was a very good example of that. This last winter, where we had, I believe it was around 12 inches of rain or something ridiculous like that in October, which from a practical standpoint for the survival of fish was pretty much useless. The fish weren't coming in the stream at that time. It had all flushed out. The streams had come back down by the time the fish were actually trying to access these streams. And yet, if you were to look at the statistics for the water year, people would have said it was a good water year. But the practical application for the species was pretty useless. So any way I mean, I would love to have a better way to communicate what we're talking about beyond just like water year and inches of precipitation, something that's more reflective of reality.
Andrew, I'm going to pass this question to Britt for a moment. It's a really valid question that a lot of people are talking about, to be honest.
Yeah, and I can't speak directly to California, but I think there's a lot of similar issues in the Northwest, and that's been one of the biggest priorities the Northwest partners have had is drought communication and how do we communicate this? It's not just about the sheer amount of precipitation, but when it comes or when it doesn't come. And, you have one big storm move through and there's the drought's over, or a big atmospheric river. And I know we've tried, like earlier this year, we did a big communication piece between California and the Northwest or I guess late last year, I should say calendar year, when there were some big storms that moved through, and it was like, yes, those help, but those don't ameliorate the drought completely. And we would love to, kind of work with you on some messaging, because I think one place we struggle is around some of the ecological impacts and the impacts to fisheries. We've also, last year was the first year we actually had some requests from, some fisheries related groups who wanted us to come talk, because their conversations at some of their meetings with some of the aquaculture groups, there was no talk of drought or no talk of lack of precipitation. And a couple of the folks were like, wait a second, this is a big issue. So if there's any way we can help with those communication and the messages and the messaging, we do these drought status updates occasionally where we really try to hone in on some of the impacts and some of the messaging. And in the Northwest, we've started doing media briefings around some of these events, just to try to help with the messaging. So would love to talk more about how to incorporate better messaging around some of the ecological impacts in fisheries.
Yeah, it's almost like we need a new metric. I mean, it's like we're trying to fit square pegs in round holes here. And it's like, if we could find a way to better define, I mean, in some ways I wish the water year thing would just go away so we could, start fresh. but yeah, so no, thank you for that, for the offer. One of our communications person from our group, Sarah Nossaman, she'll probably follow up with you guys at some point.
Perfect.
Yeah,
that would be great.
And Andrew, and your coordinator is Amanda Sheffield. So she'd love to talk to you. Okay. Anything else from Team NIDIS or Team Sea Grant?
Meredith, I think Sam has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Sam. Thanks.
Oh, hi. Really good point by Andrew about the confusion that we create with the water year. And because the public doesn't really get that cycle you're right, Britt. One solution that Britt shared, which really opened my thinking, was she mentioned fishing groups. And I'm thinking that user groups, whether they be fishermen's group or, hobbyist fishermen's, paddleboarders, farming groups, I think they could be part of our allies in helping us communicate, but we actually have to give them the proper tools and the messaging to do that. And I was thinking, have we done workshops with broadcast meteorologists? I asked because many of these broadcast meteorologists, they're young, very adapted, they're very social media savvy. What are our opportunities about connecting in terms of training with broadcast meteorologists?
We haven't really, I think, at least I'm speaking at least for what I've heard in the Midwest, Great Lakes area, that I think that's been identified as a group that we should be doing more outreach to. And I know that's something I would like to do, but we meaning NIDIS, really hasn't gone down that route yet. But I think that is definitely something that we know is probably needed, especially since they are kind of the face of what people see when they talk about weather locally. So I think it is a really important group. I don't know, Britt or Meredith, if you're aware of other efforts.
I certainly with the weather service forecasters, there are ongoing efforts to train them, including this year, they're going to be focusing on messaging of drought, both in just more traditional drought, but also now you have, it's more complicated, how drought on top of long-term airification and climate change, or drought, how do you communicate drought in areas where the public is usually used to too much water, or flash drought, which is rapid onset drought. But the broadcast meteorology, I think that's an excellent suggestion and something I do think we should. We have, for example, I have some broadcast meteorologists coming to our Southeast DEWS meetings. These regional networks do have usual meetings, usually, annually or maybe a little less frequently. So there might be some representation there, but not enough. So thank you for raising that point.
Yeah, and
Recently, on
sorry, go
social
ahead.
media, I saw a broadcast meteorologist who showed photos of them attending AMS, American Meteorological Society, with other broadcast meteorologists. I thought, wow, that would be a great way for us to connect, just to get some ideas on how we can better connect, maybe. So it could be done more subtly initially, and then we plan, to focus it more in terms of professional development for them.
Yeah, this is Britt. That's a fascinating. I love this idea and would love to work, between the two groups with some of our media contacts. Because I will say that I mentioned we've done a couple media briefings in the Northwest now, and we're really trying to build up, a kind of a communication list in that area. And it's been really interesting. The first was really well attended. The second one, there wasn't a whole lot of new news. So that was a lesson for us, is like, if there's not some kind of big story, we probably don't want to try to communicate with them in that way. But we've gotten great response, just them kind of saying, thank you for helping us with the messaging and for we give them the opportunity to talk to like their state climatologists and state drought coordinators, and ask direct questions through these media briefings. And, that's one way we've tried to address it, but actually offering, more of a training is a fascinating idea. So I like that one a lot.
Karen, I think I'm going to pass it back to you right now. I want to again thank all of you for sticking around. I know this was late in the day for some of you, and we're really grateful for the input. And I hope you reach out to us if you ever need anything. And hopefully we'll take away a few gems from here, and there'll be some follow-up discussions. Karen?
Well, thank you, Meredith and Molly, for sure, and the rest of the NIDIS people that were able to join us and weigh in. We really appreciate your help and all the information that you provided for us today. Just want to let everybody know that we do have 2 more webinars that we're planning for later this fall. One of them about the publicly available information from the National Water Model, and another on HABs. If you have any interest in serving on the planning committee or helping to support either of those, please send me a message. But for now, thank you all for joining us, and for NIDIS for sponsoring this and providing your information and such a great conversation. If you'd like to become a member of the Water Resources Network, please let me know. And otherwise, thank you all, and we'll see you next time. So have a great afternoon.